Guys, things are not looking good for Alvin Bragg right now. And from what I can see, it honestly looks like his entire house of cards is about to collapse in on itself. There's a lot to cover, but I figure a good place to start is he's about to get sued for malicious prosecution by Daniel Penny.
The guilt I would have felt if someone did get hurt, if he did do what he was threatening to do, would never be able to live with myself.
Daniel Penny speaking exclusively to Fox for the first time since being cleared of all charges.
This, as his defense team tells us, they're considering filing their own lawsuit for malicious persecution. Good for them.
The lawsuit isn't even necessarily about breaking the law, attorney Stephen Razor told Fox and Friends on Wednesday morning. It's blurring ethical boundaries and failing to act in a manner in which you are expected because of your office. That includes pushing for an arrest not to protect the public, but allegedly to protect Bragg's image, he said. It was clear there was a fear that if an arrest wasn't made, and made very quickly, that there might be rioting in the streets, and that may ultimately look very bad for District Attorney Alvin Bragg. And in fact, if that happened, that could affect his re-election.
What I do know is that it was based on the application of the District Attorney's Office. And just like Danny said in his interview, it was like they wanted to try and get him on something. They knew they weren't going to be able to get him, so they had to get rid of that top count in order to get to that second count, just in the hopes that maybe they could pull out a win here, and they were unsuccessful, thank God.
Yeah,
You know, I think
Just like Fannie Willis and Letitia James, these people campaigning on these partisan hack jobs. They literally campaign on the promise to use lawfare to go after their political enemies. It's wild. Apparently, they believe Alvin Bragg's office literally colluded with the medical examiner to come out with essentially what they're saying equates to a falsified report, from my understanding.
who exactly are you going? Is this against Alvin Bragg? Who does this actually go against?
Well, it goes against Alvin Bragg for the way in which he handled this case and the
Anyone else?
ethical lines that were blurred. Yeah, I mean, the medical examiner's office, Chief Graham, for his involvement in this case. I mean, the record was made fairly clear as to the extent of his involvement in what occurred here. You know, he was appointed by Mayor Adams, same political party as Alvin Bragg. There was collusion there. And I mean, the collusion began from the very beginning of this case and all the way through. The district attorney needed the medical examiner and needed the medical examiner to act quickly, and he did just that.
The medical examiner rushed to get everything done before the toxicology report even came back. I think what they're saying is the point of all of this collusion was that Alvin Bragg was worried about some sort of political backlash from this overall case that could affect his re-election if he didn't thread the PR needle correctly. And so he was placing his weight on the scale of justice to try to make sure that the PR game worked out for himself. Which, I mean, can you really argue with that assessment? That seems to be the one common denominator between Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, Fannie Willis, Matthew Graves. They will all tip the weight on the scales of justice to make sure that the PR game works out for themselves. Now, this unconditional discharge, this no punishment in the hush money conviction, you might think that it's not really relevant. He's still stuck with the felony, the big F. But it matters on appeal that Judge Juan thought that there wasn't even enough strength to this case to issue a punishment in the sentence.
They're saying, I just noticed where he said I was falsifying business records. Well, the falsification of business records, as they say it, was calling a legal expense in the books where everybody could see them, a legal expense. In other words, that legal fees or legal expense were put down as legal expense by accountants. They weren't put down by me. They were put down by accountants. I didn't call them construction, concrete work. I didn't call them electrical work. I didn't call them anything. They called a legal fee or a legal expense. And for this, I got indicted.
Judge Juan tries to defend himself after Trump's sentencing, but he and Bragg are responsible for this monster.
It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work. And the people of our country got to see this firsthand because they watched the case in your courtroom. They got to see this firsthand, and then they voted, and I won and got the largest number of votes by far.
On Friday, the sentencing of President-elect Donald Trump saw one of the most impassioned defense arguments given in such a hearing in years. From the judge himself, Merchan allowed a dead misdemeanor to be resuscitated by allowing Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg to effectively prosecute declined federal offenses. He allowed a jury to convict Trump without any agreement, let alone unanimity, on what actually occurred in the case. Merchan ruled that the jury did not have to agree on why Trump committed an alleged offense in describing settlement costs as legal costs. Neither the defendant nor the public will ever know what the jury ultimately found in its verdict. I once described this case as a legal Frankenstein. It is the ultimate gravedigger charge, where Bragg unearthed the case from 2016 and through a series of novel steps is seeking to bring it back to life. Bragg is combining parts from both state and federal codes.
The partisan DA that campaigned on going after President Trump, whose newly hired lead prosecutor for the case also had a history of taking on President Trump, also had their case in front of a partisan judge. A judge who donated to President Biden, who imposed a gag order on President Trump, who told the jury they didn't need to reach a unanimous decision, and prevented one of our witnesses today, Mr. Smith, an expert on campaign finance, from giving real testimony to the court.
Even liberal legal experts have denounced the case, and Senator John Fetterman recently called it total bull. Merchan knows there's a fair chance this monstrosity will finally die on appeal, and he was making the case for his own conduct. The verdict, however, is likely to last far longer than the Trump verdict. It is a judgment against not just Merchan, but the New York legal system, which allowed itself to be weaponized against political opponents. Now Trump can appeal the case as a whole. And then there's the Matthew Colangelo angle. Matthew Colangelo was a former senior Biden Justice Department official who applied to be lead attorney in the political prosecution of President Trump under Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. And do you know who his references were?
One of the first things Alvin Bragg did was hire Matthew Colangelo, a top official in the Biden Justice Department who had a history of taking on President Trump and his family's businesses. It's also interesting to note who Mr. Colangelo listed as his references when he applied for the job at the Justice Department. He listed Tom Perez, former DNC chair, and Jeff Zients, who is now President Biden's chief of staff. That's right. The head of the DNC and the Biden White House chief of staff, those were his references. That's the guy who went to work to be the lead prosecutor on the case against President Trump.
You guys remember Fani Willis, her prosecutor Nathan Wade, how he met with the DOJ, right, and charged those hours?
In May 2022, Wade billed for a meeting with the White House counsel's office at his hourly rate of $250. But when asked about it, Wade could not detail the purpose of the meeting. Wade used some version of "I don't recall" more than 30 times when questioned by lawmakers and staff during closed-door testimony.
So you've got Matthew Colangelo moving from the Biden administration's DOJ to work under Alvin Bragg. You've got Nathan Wade working under Fani Willis, meeting with the DOJ, the Biden administration's DOJ. Now all of this, in just the past couple of months, has started to be put together by House Oversight committees that now that the new administration is coming in, they're going to be able to send criminal referrals to who? Pam Bondi, and who else? Kesh Patel. Even MSNBC couldn't resist taking a jab at the prosecution this past year. The Manhattan DA's office has prosecuted a number of falsification of business records cases. These are usually straightforward, run-of-the-mill paper crimes. Bragg has even referenced them as the bread and butter of his office's white-collar work. But it's the added theory that Bragg chose to employ in this trial. The Washington Post reviewed the New York State Law Reporting Bureau as far back as 2000 for any relevant case law regarding this specific statute. The report found 2 entries in which a judge issued legal opinions on the statute. Both were from Judge Juan Merchan last year in rejecting Trump's motions to have the case dismissed. That's how rarely Section 17152 is prosecuted in New York. And that fact makes Bragg's decision to primarily premise the prosecution on a former president of the United States on that statute even more novel. Guys, you remember in 2022 when there were calls for Bragg to resign? Well, it's happening all over again. After Daniel Penny's not guilty verdict, calls mount for DA Alvin Bragg to resign in shame. Calls for Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg to be booted from office intensified over the controversial prosecutor's decision to take Daniel Penny to trial in Jordan Neely's chokehold discontinuation. Just after the jury's bombshell not guilty verdict on Monday, Republican lawmakers slammed Bragg for taking on the case, claiming the borough's top prosecutor had done so for political purposes, with one even urging the U.S. Department of Justice to launch an investigation. You can't do this to American heroes, Texas GOP Rep Chip Roy said to Fox Business. And there was a lot of state politicians getting in on it too. Joining the calls was State Assemblyman Michael Tenusis from Staten Island, who charged that Bragg wasted taxpayer dollars by filing charges against Penny. Penny was wrongfully accused and slandered to better serve the DA's skewed agenda. New Yorkers stood up against the unlawfulness and dishonesty, the lawmaker said. If only Alvin Bragg did his job and protected New Yorkers, the city would be a lot safer than it is today. Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman called Penny a hero, not a villain. The city councilman, Joe Borelli, said the case underscores nothing than the perverse sense of justice held by Alvin Bragg. The district attorney should resign in shame. These are local politicians coming out, man. Councilwoman Inna Vernikov, R. Brooklyn, added a sarcastic note. I'm sure that DA Bragg will be more than eager to prosecute anyone rioting in light of this verdict as swiftly and as harshly as he did Daniel Penny. Yeah, right. Sure. Bob Holden, a Queens Democratic council member, said that with case after case, Bragg demonstrates a contempt for reality and common sense, pursuing heroes like Daniel Penny while allowing criminals to roam our streets. For the sake of New Yorkers, the governor must remove him. This cannot continue. Even Democrats are saying this now. So just to recap with our boy Alvin Bragg, he's about to get sued out the wazoo by Daniel Penny. His case against Trump, the conviction, is not looking good on appeal. There are fresh calls for him to resign right now, okay? Even from Democrats locally in his area, all right? And beyond all of that, the House committee is preparing information for criminal referrals they will be handing, not just to Pam Bondi, but also to, guess who? Kash Patel. So, Alvin Bragg, getting his just desserts. I hope it tastes good, buddy. You know who else is getting the karma right now? Gavin Newsom, because his whole career is up in flames and those fires down in California right now. Check it out up top. Hey, come check in on Fannie Willis with me, guys. Things are only getting worse for her right now as the courts have ordered her to drop $20K.